On October 2, 1945, Korea finally won its freedom from Japanese colonial rule that had lasted over 35 years. But this is not the end of the story. In fact, it's where the story starts. What? You don't know what Korea has to do with Japan? Well, stay tuned till the end, and I promise you will learn something new here today. Let me take you back to August 15, 1945. This day is known as Liberation Day, or Gwangbokjeol in Korea. It marks the anniversary of Korea's independence from Japanese colonial rule. The Japanese occupation had been brutal and oppressive, but on this day, it finally came to an end. The people of Korea rejoiced and celebrated their newfound freedom. They had endured decades of hardship and persecution, but now they were finally able to look forward to a brighter future for themselves and their children. The celebrations lasted for days, as people took to the streets en masse to show their support for their country and their pride in their culture. There were parades, music, dancing, and fireworks. It was a time for the people of Korea to come together and heal as a nation. But while the celebrations were in full swing, few people knew that the future of Korea would soon be decided by outsiders. As the Allied forces advanced into Korea, the Japanese began to flee, leaving behind a power vacuum that would soon be filled by the United States and the Soviet Union. The two superpowers had agreed to divide the peninsula along the 38th parallel with the Soviets in the north and the Americans in the south. But this decision would have profound consequences for the Korean people. Despite their joy at being free from Japanese rule, Koreans on both sides of the border would soon find themselves caught in the middle of a new conflict. The division of Korea was a temporary measure intended to ensure a peaceful departure of Japanese troops. However, the two superpowers soon began to see the peninsula as a potential battleground in the escalating Cold War. The US and the USSR each sought to expand their sphere of influence in Asia, and Korea became a key part of that struggle. The presence of foreign troops in Korea heightened tensions, and the potential for conflict grew. Koreans on both sides of the border were caught in the crossfire, and many began to fear that their country was being used as a pawn in a larger geopolitical game. As the Cold War intensified, so did the conflict in Korea. The division of the peninsula had created a deep rift between the two Koreas, and neither side was willing to compromise. The situation was further complicated by the presence of foreign powers, and the Korean people were caught in the middle. Despite the pain and suffering that they had endured, the Korean people refused to be divided. They yearned for a unified and independent Korea that was free from foreign influence. However, their hopes for a peaceful resolution were dashed when the North Korean leader Kim Il-sung launched a surprise attack across the 38th parallel. The South Korean government was caught off guard, and the North Korean army quickly made significant gains. The United States, which had a mutual defense agreement with South Korea, intervened militarily to help repel the North Korean advance. Soon the conflict had escalated into a full-blown war. The Korean War was one of the most brutal and divisive conflicts of the 20th century. It pitted brother against brother, and it left the peninsula devastated. But amidst the chaos and destruction, the Korean people demonstrated remarkable resilience and courage. They endured years of war and hardship, but they never gave up hope for a better future. By 1953, the war had finally come to an end. The fighting had taken a heavy toll on both sides, and a peace agreement was signed. The border between North and South Korea was established at the 38th parallel, effectively dividing the peninsula in two. Although the war had ended, the division of Korea remained a source of tension and conflict. In the decades since the Korean War, the two Koreas have developed into separate and distinct entities. North Korea has become one of the most isolated and secretive countries in the world, ruled by an authoritarian regime that has brutally suppressed any dissent. South Korea, on the other hand, has transformed itself into a major economic and technological powerhouse. Yet despite their differences, the Korean people have never given up hope for reunification. However, reunification seems increasingly unlikely as time goes on. The two Koreas have become so ideologically and economically divergent that it is hard to imagine them ever coming together again. North Korea's nuclear weapons program has also made reunification even more challenging, as it has increased tensions on the peninsula and raised the stakes of any potential conflict. Moreover, the strong U.S. military presence in South Korea has further complicated the issue. Many Koreans in the South see the U.S. military as a crucial deterrent against any possible North Korean aggression. Removing the US troops would likely be seen as a betrayal of the alliance between the two countries and could lead to instability on the peninsula. Ultimately, the future of Korea remains uncertain. Will the two Koreas eventually reunite, or are they destined to remain divided forever? Only time will tell. Now, let's get back to the video. What caused Japan to annex Korea? In the early 20th century, Japan was a rapidly industrializing and militarizing nation that was eager to expand its influence in the region. At the time, Korea was still a weak and divided peninsula with a long history of foreign influence. Japan saw an opportunity to gain a strategic advantage by controlling Korea and its proximity to Russia. Japan's growing navy would be able to monitor Russian movements in the Pacific and keep an eye on their Pacific fleet stationed in Port Arthur. Additionally, Japan could use Korea as a base to project its power further into East Asia. However, annexing Korea was not without its challenges. The Korean Empire was still technically independent, and the Chinese and Russians had interests in the peninsula. Japan needed a way to overcome these obstacles and secure its control over Korea. The Russo-Japanese War provided Japan with the perfect opportunity to achieve its goals. The war was fought primarily on Korean soil and resulted in a decisive Japanese victory. This victory demonstrated Japan's military strength and established its dominance in East Asia. It also weakened both Russia and China, who had both been rivals for influence in Korea. With its rivals weakened and its own power growing, Japan was in a strong position to push for the annexation of Korea. The Japanese government began to exert increasing pressure on the Korean Empire, demanding reforms that would make it easier for Japan to control the country. One of the key provisions of the Treaty of Portsmouth, which ended the Russo-Japanese War, was a commitment by both Russia and China to not interfere in Korean affairs. This gave Japan the green light to move forward with its plans. A series of treaties and agreements were signed between Japan and Korea that forced the Korean Empire to cede more and more of its sovereignty to Japan. The Korean people were largely unaware of these developments and the impact they would have on their country's future. Finally, in 1910, the Japanese government officially annexed Korea, ending the country's centuries-old independence. The news of the annexation spread quickly throughout the peninsula, and the Korean people were outraged. Riots and protests erupted across the country as people took to the streets to demand the reversal of the Japanese government as decision, but their efforts were in vain. The Japanese military was called in to suppress the unrest, and those who resisted were arrested or killed. The annexation of Korea by Japan was a major turning point in the history of East Asia. It marked the beginning of a new era of Japanese imperialism and oppression that would have a profound impact on the Korean people and the region as a whole. The Korean people's struggle for independence from Japanese rule would be a long and arduous one, but it would ultimately be successful. On September 2, 1945, Japan officially surrendered, marking the end of World War II and the beginning of a new chapter for Korea. The country was finally free from Japanese colonial rule after more than 35 years of oppression. However, the challenges facing the Korean people were far from over. The country was divided between the Soviet Union and the United States, and tensions were high as the two superpowers prepared for a showdown in the Cold War. Despite these challenges, the Korean people were determined to rebuild their country and create a new future for themselves. In the decades since then, South Korea has emerged as one of the most successful economies in the world and a major player on the global stage. The country's remarkable transformation is a testament to the resilience and determination of the Korean people. So remember, the next time you hear about Korea, it's not just a country that makes your phone or your car. It's a nation with a rich history and a bright future ahead of it. That's all for today. See you next time.